History remembers Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Westford, for his staggering wealth and the notorious scandal that almost ruined his family name in 1892. But the history books completely miss the truth of how he was saved. It wasn't a strategic marriage to a wealthy heiress, and it certainly wasn't a brilliant political maneuver in the House of Lords. The salvation of the Sterling dynasty rested entirely in the dirt-stained hands of a 22-year-old florist named Genevieve Hayes. She had only gone to the Westford estate to deliver 3 dozen white lilies. She never expected the Duke's mother to lock the parlour door, slide a cheque for £10,000 across the mahogany table, and whisper, "Act like you love him, or we will both lose everything." London in the autumn of 1892 was a city of stark, brutal contrasts. While the aristocracy danced in gaslit ballrooms drowning in silk and champagne, the working class fought for breath in the smog-choked streets of Covent Garden. Genevieve Hayes belonged firmly to the latter. Genevieve was the proprietor of the Gilded Petal, a small, struggling florist shop she had inherited after the sudden passing of her father, a formerly respected botanist who had fallen out of favour with the Royal Horticultural Society. Genevieve had inherited his genius for cultivating rare blooms, but genius didn't pay the mounting debts her father had left behind. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and her younger sister, Clara, was battling a persistent lung infection that required medicine Genevieve simply could not afford. It was a cold Tuesday morning when the salvation and the curse of her life arrived in the form of a heavily embossed, wax-sealed envelope. It was an emergency commission from the Westford estate in Mayfair. The order was exorbitant: 60 elaborate centerpieces of white lilies, orchids, and weeping ferns to be delivered and arranged by that evening for a private memorial gathering. The sum offered for the sudden labour was enough to keep the Gilded Petal open for another 6 months. Genevieve didn't hesitate. She loaded her cart, her hands raw from stripping thorns and binding stems, and made the trek to the wealthiest district in London. The Westford estate was less a home and more a fortress of white marble and wrought iron. When Genevieve arrived at the servants' entrance, she was immediately ushered not into the kitchens, but up the servants' stairs and toward the grand drawing-room by a frantic, tight-lipped butler named Mr. Carson. "The Dowager Duchess wishes to inspect the arrangements personally," Carson murmured, his eyes darting nervously. "Do not speak unless spoken to, Miss Hayes." Genevieve pushed her heavy cart into a room that smelled of beeswax, old money, and cold ash. Sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by an unlit fireplace was Dowager Duchess Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor was a woman who commanded gravity. Dressed in severe black mourning silk, her silver hair pulled into an immaculate chignon, she possessed a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Genevieve curtsied clumsily, acutely aware of the soil under her fingernails and the fraying hem of her wool skirt. "Bring that lily arrangement closer, girl," Eleanor commanded. Her voice was sharp, a perfectly tuned instrument of authority. Genevieve complied, lifting the heavy crystal vase. As she set it down on the table beside the Duchess, the older woman didn't look at the flowers. She looked at Genevieve. She studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the intelligent, exhausted hazel eyes, the proud set of her jaw. "You are Thomas Hayes's daughter," Eleanor stated. It wasn't a question. "I am, Your Grace," Genevieve replied, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of panic in her chest. "Your father was a brilliant man, but a fool with his finances. I am told you have inherited both his talent and his debt." Eleanor leaned forward, her rings clinking against the mahogany table. "The bank takes your shop at the end of the month. Your sister is ill. You are desperate. Genevieve stiffened. I came to deliver flowers, Your Grace. If the arrangements are not to your liking. The flowers are irrelevant, Eleanor interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. She stood up, walking to the heavy oak doors of the parlour. With a definitive click, she turned the iron key in the lock. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. She was locked in a room with the most powerful woman in Mayfair. Eleanor walked back to the table, opened a small leather ledger, and produced a bank draft. She filled it out with a steady hand, signed her name, and slid it across the polished wood. Genevieve glanced at the number. £10,000, a sum so large it felt imaginary. It was enough to buy a massive estate, secure the best doctors in Europe for Clara, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. That is yours, Eleanor said softly, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. If you do exactly as I say. What could you possibly want from me? Genevieve whispered, her eyes glued to the paper. I want you, the Dowager Duchess said, to become my son's fiancé, and you will act like you love him with every breath in your body. Genevieve let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sheer absurdity of the situation momentarily overriding her fear. Your Grace, I am a florist from Covent Garden. I smell of fertilizer and damp earth. Your son is the Duke of Westford. The aristocracy would sooner accept a stray dog at their dinner tables. The aristocracy, Eleanor replied coldly, will accept whatever narrative I feed them, provided it is entertaining enough to distract them from the truth. The Dowager Duchess began to pace, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound in the cavernous room. She laid bare the reality of the Sterling family's precarious position. Arthur Sterling, the current Duke of Westford, was 28 years old, devastatingly handsome, and perilously close to ruin. For the past 2 years he had been engaged in a reckless, passionate affair with Lady Catherine Kensington, the wife of Lord Henry Kensington, a powerful and vindictive member of Parliament. It was a poorly kept secret, Eleanor explained, her lip curling in disgust. But last week Arthur was careless. Lord Henry discovered a cache of letters. He is preparing to divorce Catherine and name my son in the proceedings. In our world, Miss Hayes, a scandal of this magnitude does not just ruin a reputation, it ruins a legacy. The House of Lords will turn on him. The family's holdings, our investments, our social standing, it will all burn to ash. But how does a fake engagement to a commoner solve that? Genevieve asked, struggling to grasp the Machiavellian logic of high society. Because Lord Henry is holding his tongue until the end of the social season to gather his evidence, we must strike first. If Arthur suddenly announces a sweeping, dramatic, secret engagement to an unexpected outsider, it changes the narrative. It paints the rumours of his affair with Catherine as the jealous fabrications of a bitter husband. No one would believe Arthur would carry on an affair with an older married woman when he is supposedly utterly bewitched by a beautiful, tragic, hidden gem of a girl. Eleanor stopped in front of Genevieve. You are perfect. You are educated enough to speak properly, yet poor enough to be utterly dependent on me. You have no aristocratic family ties that might leak the secret, and most importantly, you are entirely out of Arthur's usual realm. It will appear to be an act of blinding, irrational love. And what happens when this blinding love ends? In 1 year, Eleanor said, tapping the desk, you will suffer a tragic change of heart and break the engagement. Arthur will play the heartbroken, honourable gentleman. The scandal with Catherine will have blown over, Lord Henry will have moved on to other political battles, and Arthur will quietly marry a suitable heiress of my choosing. You will take this £10,000, disappear to Paris or Rome, and never speak of the Sterlings again." Genevieve stared at the cheque. It was a devil's bargain. She would be entering a world of vipers, forced to lie to the faces of the most powerful people in England, tied to a man who was likely as arrogant as he was reckless. If she were caught, she would be ruined. But if she walked out that door, she would lose her shop, and Clara would likely not survive the winter. Genevieve reached across the table, picked up the pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the ironclad contract Eleanor had produced from a desk drawer. "When do I meet him?" Genevieve asked, her hand trembling slightly. "In 10 minutes, Eleanor replied, unlocking the parlour door. "And Miss Hayes, I suggest you prepare yourself. My son does not yet know about this arrangement." Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Westford, possessed the kind of striking, aristocratic beauty that made people forgive him for terrible things. He had sharp, brooding features, dark hair, and eyes the colour of a stormy sea. When he stormed into the drawing room 15 minutes later, smelling of expensive scotch and suppressed fury, Genevieve immediately understood why Lady Catherine had risked her marriage for him. "Mother, what is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded, not even glancing at Genevieve. "Carson said you ordered me down here immediately. I am not in the mood for your lectures on duty today." "Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and dangerously calm, "allow me to introduce you to your new fiancée, Miss Genevieve Hayes." Arthur stopped fallen. He slowly turned his head, finally registering the young woman in the worn wool skirt standing quietly by the fireplace. He looked from Genevieve to his mother, a harsh, mocking laugh escaping his lips. "Is this a joke? Because it is entirely devoid of humour." "It is your salvation, Arthur," Eleanor snapped, the mask of civility dropping. "Henry Kensington knows. He has the letters. He is preparing to destroy you." Arthur's face went completely pale. The arrogance drained from him, leaving behind something fractured and panicked. "Catherine," he whispered. "Catherine is looking out for herself, as she always has," Eleanor cut in brutally. "She has fled to her family's country estate to weather the storm. You, however, are going to weather it by falling madly, publicly in love with Miss Hayes. You will debut her tonight at the autumn ball." "Tonight?" Arthur roared, the colour rushing back to his face. "You want me to parade a street peddler in front of the entirety of London society tonight? They will laugh us out of the ballroom." "They will be too shocked to laugh," Eleanor countered. Arthur turned his furious gaze on Genevieve. He stalked toward her, invading her space, looking down at her with pure, unfiltered contempt. "How much did she pay you?" he sneered softly. "How much to buy a soul these days?" Genevieve did not flinch. She met his stormy eyes with a steady, fiery glare of her own. £10,000, Your Grace. But considering your abysmal manners, I am beginning to think I severely undercharged her." Arthur blinked, clearly not used to being spoken to in such a manner. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps an involuntary spark of respect, crossed his face before the scowl returned. The next 6 hours were a blur of grueling transformation. Eleanor's personal maids descended upon Genevieve. She was scrubbed, buffed, and laced into a corset so tight it made her ribs ache. Her unruly hair was tamed into an elegant cascade of curls pinned with diamond combs. Finally, she was poured into a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk velvet, with a neckline that dipped daringly low, displaying a sapphire pendant that Eleanor claimed had been in the family for a century. When Genevieve looked in the mirror, the tired florist from Covent Garden was gone. Staring back at her was a woman who looked like she belonged in a royal court. At 9 o'clock, The carriage arrived at the Mayfair Assembly Rooms for the autumn ball. Arthur sat across from her in the carriage, nursing a flask, refusing to look at her. The tension between them was a physical, suffocating thing. "Listen to me," Genevieve said quietly, as the carriage rolled to a halt. "I don't want to be here any more than you do. I think you are a reckless, selfish fool who has endangered your family for a fling. But I made a deal, and I need that money. So you are going to put your arm around my waist, you are going to smile at me like I am the only woman in the world, and we are going to walk in there and put on the performance of a lifetime. Do you understand?" Arthur lowered the flask. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the stunning vision she presented in the velvet gown. A cynical smirk touched his lips. "Very well, Miss Hayes. Let us see if you are as good an actress as you are a negotiator." He stepped out of the carriage and offered his hand. When her gloved fingers touched his, a strange, unexpected jolt of electricity snapped between them. They both ignored it. As they entered the ballroom, the effect was instantaneous. The music seemed to falter. Conversations fall. Hundreds of eyes turned to the entrance. The Duke of Westford, London's most notorious elusive bachelor, was not only attending the ball, but he was escorting a breathtakingly beautiful woman no one had ever seen before. Arthur's hand rested on the small of her back, his grip firm, almost bruising. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Smile, darling," he murmured, his voice laced with mock affection. "They are staring." "I am smiling, my love," Genevieve whispered back, offering a radiant, closed-mouthed smile to the crowd, while digging her fingernails discreetly into his forearm. They moved through the room, a flawless picture of devotion. Arthur introduced her to dukes, earls, and viscounts. Genevieve played her part perfectly. Demure but witty, using her father's aristocratic education to navigate the subtle insults and probing questions of the elite. She could feel Arthur relaxing slightly, realizing that she was not going to embarrass him. But the true test came an hour into the evening. As they stood near the champagne fountain, a hush fell over the immediate crowd. Approaching them, her face pale and her eyes blazing with a mixture of betrayal and fury, was Lady Catherine Kensington. Arthur's hand tightened painfully around Genevieve's waist. He stopped breathing. Catherine stopped 2 feet from them. She looked Genevieve up and down with utter disdain before locking eyes with Arthur. "Arthur," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I heard a rumor. I had to see the farce with my own eyes." The crowd around them went deathly silent, waiting for the explosion. Arthur was frozen, caught between the woman he loved and the survival of his family name. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Seeing his panic, Genevieve stepped forward, placing a gentle, proprietary hand flat against Arthur's chest, right over his racing heart. "You must be Lady Catherine," Genevieve said, her voice carrying the perfect pitch of polite curiosity. She looked up at Arthur with eyes swimming with manufactured adoration. "Arthur has told me so much about you. He said you were a remarkably loyal friend to him during his lonelier years. I'm so glad to finally meet you." Catherine's face turned the color of chalk. The implication was clear. Catherine was a relic of the past, a pitied friend, while Genevieve was the present. Arthur stared down at Genevieve, his eyes wide with genuine shock. In that fleeting second, under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by the vicious gossip-mongers of London, the lines of their fake arrangement violently blurred. The carriage ride back to the Westford estate was shrouded in a heavy charged silence. The adrenaline of the ballroom was fading, leaving Genevieve acutely aware of the agonizing pinch of her corset, and the lingering scent of Arthur's sandalwood cologne. Arthur sat opposite her, the street lamps casting long, flickering shadows across his sharp jawline. He was no longer nursing his silver flask. Instead, he was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "That was remarkably cruel," he finally said, his voice a low baritone that rumbled in the small carriage. "What you said to Catherine." Genevieve did not look away. "It was necessary. She was about to cause a scene that would have rendered your mother's £10,000 a complete waste. I merely reminded her of her place." "Her place?" Arthur echoed, a bitter edge to his tone. "And what is your place, Miss Hayes? A hired actress playing dress-up in family heirlooms?" "My place," Genevieve replied coldly, "is keeping you out of the House of Lords firing squad. You are welcome, Your Grace." Arthur let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his dark hair. The anger in his eyes fractured, revealing the sheer, exhausting weight of his reality. "You are terrifyingly good at this. For a moment, even I believed you were entirely besotted with me." "It is called acting, Arthur. I suggest you learn how to do it before Lord Henry decides to investigate us further." Over the next 3 weeks, their fabricated romance became the absolute obsession of London. The Dowager Duchess orchestrated their public appearances with the ruthless precision of a military general. They were seen strolling through Hyde Park, sharing whispered, supposedly intimate conversations at the newly opened Savoy Hotel, and sitting side by side in the royal box at Covent Garden, an irony that was not lost on Genevieve, whose actual life lay just a few poverty-stricken blocks away. Genevieve played the devoted fiancé flawlessly. She learned to laugh at his dry jokes, to rest her hand lightly on his forearm when navigating a crowd, and to look at him with a starry-eyed reverence that made the society matron swoon. Arthur, to his credit, began to hold up his end of the bargain. He was attentive, fiercely protective of her in crowded rooms, and played the reformed rake with surprising conviction. But behind closed doors, their relationship remained a battlefield of sharp retorts and carefully maintained distance. Then came the afternoon tea at the estate of Lady Beatrice Sterling, Arthur's aunt. Eleanor had insisted Genevieve attend alone to prove she could hold her own among the viper pit of aristocratic women. Genevieve was holding a fragile porcelain teacup, expertly deflecting questions about her mysterious country upbringing, when a familiar, chilling voice cut through the chatter. "I must say, Miss Hayes, your knowledge of horticulture is simply astounding," Lady Catherine said smoothly, stepping into Genevieve's path. The other women hushed, sensing the crimson in the water. Catherine smiled, but her eyes were venomous. "In fact, my personal maid mentioned she saw a girl who looked exactly like you, hauling sacks of fertilizer near a rather dingy shop called the Gilded Petal. Tell me, do you have a twin sister in the slums?" The teacup in Genevieve's hand rattled against the saucer. The room fell deathly silent. Catherine had not retreated. She had been digging. "I am afraid your maid must be mistaken, Lady Catherine," Genevieve said, her voice steady despite the icy terror pooling in her stomach. "Though I do have a deep fondness for botany. My father, Thomas Hayes, was a recognized scholar of the Royal Horticultural Society." It was a gamble, a partial truth wrapped in an aristocratic shield. Catherine leaned in closer, dropping her voice so only Genevieve could hear. "I know exactly what you are, you little gutter snipe. I don't know how Eleanor is blackmailing you into this, but I will strip this velvet off your back. I am going to the Pall Mall Gazette tomorrow. Enjoy your final night in Mayfair." Catherine swept out of the room, leaving Genevieve feeling as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. If Catherine went to the press, the scandal wouldn't just ruin Arthur, it would destroy Genevieve. She would be charged with fraud, imprisoned, and Clara would be left to fall alone in the cold. Genevieve practically fled the tea party. When she arrived back at the Westford estate, she bypassed the grand entrance entirely, rushing around the gravel path toward the sprawling, neglected glass conservatory at the back of the property. It was the only place in the massive stone fortress where she felt she could breathe. The air inside was thick, humid, and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Genevieve collapsed onto a weathered wooden bench, burying her face in her hands, a dry sob tearing from her throat. The walls were closing in. The £10,000, safely deposited in an account for Clara's care, felt like crimson money. She didn't hear the heavy iron door open, nor the crunch of boots on the gravel. "Genevieve!" She flinched, snapping her head up to see Arthur standing at the end of the aisle. He had discarded his formal coat, his waistcoat was unbuttoned, and his sleeves were rolled up. For the first time, he didn't look like a duke, he just looked like a man. He closed the distance between them, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Carson said you ran past him looking like you'd seen a ghost. What happened at Beatrice's?" "She knows," Genevieve whispered, her voice trembling. The iron facade she had worn for 3 weeks completely shattered. "Catherine. She knows about the gilded petal. She knows I'm a fraud. She is going to the papers tomorrow." Arthur froze. A dark, terrifying fury washed over his features, but it wasn't directed at Genevieve. "She threatened you," he stated, his voice dangerously low. "Arthur, if she exposes this, they will lock me away. Clara, my sister, she will have no one. I can't go to prison." Tears finally spilled over her lashes, hot and humiliating. Before she could wipe them away, Arthur knelt in the dirt in front of her. The Duke of Westford, in his immaculate trousers, kneeling on the damp, soil-covered floor of a greenhouse. He reached out, his large warm hands gently gripping her trembling ones. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Genevieve met his eyes. The stormy sea of his gaze was entirely focused on her, anchoring her in the panic. "No one is going to prison, and no one is taking your sister's care away," Arthur said, his thumbs brushing soothingly over her knuckles. "I dragged you into this mess. I will fix it." "How? Catherine holds all the cards." "Catherine thinks she is playing a game with a desperate boy," Arthur said, his jaw clenching. "She forgets who my family is. She forgets what I can do when I am properly motivated." He stood up, pulling Genevieve to her feet with him. They were standing inches apart in the sweltering heat of the glasshouse. Genevieve looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The air between them suddenly felt heavy, charged with something entirely different from their usual bickering. "Why do you care?" Genevieve asked, her voice barely a breath. "A month ago you looked at me like I was dirt on your shoe. I am just a business transaction." Arthur lifted a hand, his fingers lightly tracing the tear track on her cheek. The touch was agonizingly tender. "Because, Genevieve, in the last 3 weeks, you are the only real thing I have encountered in this God-forsaken world. You are braver than every man in the House of Lords, and you fight for your family with a ferocity that puts mine to shame." The non-Hisim stepped closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I thought I loved Catherine, but the truth is, I merely loved the danger of her. What I feel when I look at you." He stopped, swallowing hard, pulling his hand away as if the fire between them was burning him. "I will handle Catherine, I promise you." Arthur turned and strode out of the conservatory, leaving Genevieve trembling, her heart hammering a frantic, completely unchoreographed rhythm against her ribs. The line between their fake engagement and a terrifying reality had just been obliterated. The next morning, the papers were silent. Genevieve later learned that Arthur had not gone to Catherine. He had gone straight to Lord Henry Kensington. In a closed-door meeting that lasted 3 hours, Arthur had leveraged 3 generations of sterling family secrets, calling in political debts and threatening total financial ruin to Lord Henry's parliamentary backers if his wife spoke a single word of slander against Genevieve Hayes. Catherine was muzzled. The threat was neutralized, but the victory was incredibly short-lived. That evening, as Arthur and Genevieve sat in the drawing-room reading, Carson entered bearing a silver tray with a thick gold-embossed envelope. Eleanor took it, broke the seal, and read the heavy cardstock. Her face went deathly pale. "What is it, Mother?" Arthur asked, sitting up straight. Eleanor looked up, her eyes wide with a rare naked fear. "It is an invitation from Lord Henry Kensington. He is hosting a week-long hunting party at his country estate in Yorkshire, and he has explicitly requested the presence of the Duke of Westford and his new fiancé." Arthur cursed softly. "It's a trap. Henry wants us under his roof to observe us. He suspects the engagement is a sham." "If we decline, it confirms his suspicions," Eleanor said grimly, looking at Genevieve. "If you go, you will be surrounded by their allies, isolated in the country under a microscope 24 hours a day." Eleanor set the letter down. "If you fail to convince Henry that your love is real this weekend, the scandal will break, and not even Arthur's political threats will stop it. This is the final test, Miss Hayes. You must make them believe it, no matter what." The journey to Yorkshire was a grueling 2-day trek through relentless autumn rain. Lord Henry Kensington's country estate, Blackwood Manor, loomed against the jagged moors like a Gothic nightmare of blackened stone and narrow watching windows. When the carriage finally ground to a halt on the wet gravel, Arthur did not immediately move. He looked at Genevieve, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed by the dim light of the carriage lamps. "From the moment we step down, we are on a stage," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Henry is a predator. He will look for any hesitation, any flinch. You do not leave my side." "I am perfectly capable of surviving a dinner party, Arthur," Genevieve said, though her hands were trembling slightly as she smoothed the skirts of her emerald travelling gown. Arthur reached across the space between them, capturing her hands in his. "This is not a dinner party. It is an condemnion disguised as a holiday. Just stay close to me." The heavy oak doors of Blackwood Manor swung open, and they were greeted by the chillingly polite Lord Henry Kensington. Henry was a man carved from ice and political ambition, with thinning fair hair and pale eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Beside him stood Lady Catherine, her smile brittle, her gaze resting on Genevieve with the hungry anticipation of a spider watching a fly touch its web. "Westford," Lord Henry said smoothly, offering a brief, perfunctory bow. "And the mysterious Miss Hayes. How delightful of you to brave the mud to join us." "We wouldn't have missed it, Henry," Arthur replied smoothly, his hand resting firmly on the small of Genevieve's back. The trap was sprung almost immediately. As the butler, a stiff man named Willis, led them up the grand staircase to the guest wing, he stopped before a set of heavy mahogany doors. "The master's suite, Your Grace," Willis intoned, producing a single brass key. Lord Kensington insisted you have the finest accommodations. The adjoining rooms are currently undergoing renovations, so we have prepared the primary chamber for you both." Genevieve's crimson ran cold. 1 room, 1 bed. To request separate quarters now would be a glaring admission that their passionate, whirlwind engagement was a sham. Henry was forcing them into an impossible corner. "How remarkably thoughtful of him," Arthur said without missing a beat, taking the key. He didn't look at Genevieve until the heavy door clicked shut behind them, locking them inside a sprawling room dominated by a massive 4-poster bed draped in crimson velvet. The silence that followed was suffocating. "I will sleep on the rug," Arthur announced immediately, stripping off his damp overcoat and throwing it over a nearby armchair. "Or the velvet settee, whichever looks less likely to break my spine." "Arthur, the maids will come to light the fire and turn down the bed," Genevieve whispered frantically, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "If they find you sleeping on the floor, it will be all over the house by breakfast." Arthur rubbed his temples, a sigh of pure exhaustion escaping him. "Then we rumple the bed. We make it look as though we slept in it together, and I will take the floor after they leave." That night, the charade reached a fever pitch. At dinner, Lord Henry peppered Genevieve with relentless surgical questions about her family lineage, her supposed inheritance, and how exactly she had met the Duke. Genevieve, drawing on every ounce of her father's aristocratic tutoring and her own street-forged survival instincts, parried every blow. She fabricated a tale of a chance encounter in a botanical garden, weaving in enough genuine passion for horticulture to make the lie sing, with truth. Under the table, Arthur's hand found her knee, his thumb stroking the silk of her gown in a silent, grounding rhythm. Every time Henry pushed too hard, Arthur intervened with a lazy, charming, but razor-sharp deflection, protecting her like a knight wielding a velvet-wrapped sword. But it was the isolation of the bedroom that proved the most dangerous. By the 3rd night, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the Yorkshire moors. Lightning strobed through the tall windows, casting warped shadows across the room. The temperature had plummeted, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Arthur was shivering on the small settee, wrapped in a thin blanket, his long legs cramped. Genevieve lay in the center of the massive feather bed, staring at the canopy, listening to the rattle of the window panes. "Arthur," she called out softly into the dark. "Go to sleep, Genevieve," came his gritted reply. "You are freezing. You're shivering so hard I can hear the wood of the settee creaking." "I am performing my duty as a gentleman," he rasped. "I am trying to preserve what little honor I have left." Genevieve sat up, throwing back the heavy duvet. "Honor is going to give you pneumonia, and I cannot fend off Lord Henry alone if you are bedridden." She moved to the edge of the mattress. "Get in the bed. It is large enough that we need not even touch." There was a long silence, broken only by a crack of thunder. Finally, Arthur stood up. He walked slowly to the bed, dressed only in his linen trousers and an unbuttoned shirt. He climbed into the opposite side, keeping a vast expanse of sheets between them. For an hour they lay in the dark, stiff and hyper-aware of each other's breathing. "I was terrified today," Genevieve whispered suddenly, the confession torn from her by the intimacy of the dark. "When Catherine asked about my sister, if she discovers Clara is in a sanatorium?" Arthur shifted, rolling onto his side to face her in the gloom. "I have guards posted at the sanatorium. No one will get near Clara. I promise you." Genevieve turned her head. The distance between them suddenly felt negligible. You have gone to extraordinary lengths for a woman you paid to be here." "I didn't pay you," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. "My mother did. And I would give every penny of the sterling fortune to have met you under any other circumstances." The air in the room thickened, charged with something far more potent than the storm outside. Without thinking, Arthur reached across the space, his fingers lightly brushing a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was like a struck match. Genevieve didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his palm. The pretense, the contract, the danger waiting outside their door, it all evaporated. Arthur moved closer, erasing the distance between them. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a performance for society. It was desperate, bruising, and entirely real. He kissed her like a man starving, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her against his chest. Genevieve kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring all her fear, her exhaustion, and the undeniable, terrifying love she had harbored for him into the embrace. They had been hired to act like they were in love. They had spectacularly failed to keep it an act. The final morning at Blackwood Manor dawned with a pale, watery light that struggled to pierce the thick Yorkshire mist rolling off the moors. The violent thunderstorm of the previous night had completely washed away the oppressive humidity, leaving behind a biting, skeletal cold. Inside the grand, suffocating master bedroom, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was charged with the lingering electric aftermath of a truth finally spoken and acted upon. Genevieve sat before the heavy mahogany vanity, her fingers trembling slightly as she attempted to pin her unruly dark hair into a severe, socially acceptable chignon. Her lips were still tender, her skin still flushed. The reflection staring back at her in the silver-backed mirror belonged to a woman entirely transformed. She was no longer a desperate florist playing a dangerous game of dress-up. She was a woman terrifyingly, irretrievably in love with the Duke of Westford. Arthur emerged from the dressing screen, struggling with the stiff cuffs of his morning coat. He abandoned the effort, walking up behind her. He didn't offer a charming, performative smirk. Instead, he placed his large, warm hands on her bare shoulders, the touch sending a phantom jolt straight down her spine. He leaned down, his breath ghosting over the sensitive skin of her neck, and pressed a brief, fiercely tender kiss against her pulse point. "If we stay in this room for 5 more minutes," Arthur murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that made her close her eyes, "I am going to lock the door, throw that wretched brass key out the window, and let Lord Henry fall of apoplexy in his own dining room." Genevieve let out a breathless, uneven laugh, turning her head to meet his stormy gaze in the mirror. "As delightful as that sounds, Your Grace, I believe hiding would be the very flinch Henry is waiting for. We have to go down." Arthur's expression darkened, the realities of their perilous situation crashing back down upon them. "Stay close to me," he commanded softly, his grip on her shoulders tightening just a fraction in a protective vow. "No matter what happens, Genevieve, you do not let them see you bleed." They descended the sweeping grand staircase together, presenting a unified, impenetrable front. But as they neared the entrance to the breakfast room, it became chillingly apparent that the trap had already been sprung. The low hum of morning conversation had completely ceased. The air in the cavernous hall was thick with the scent of smoked kippers, stale cigar smoke, and raw, unfiltered anticipation. Lord and Lady Arbuthnot, along with Sir Reginald and a smattering of Henry's closest political allies, were clustered near the roaring fireplace, their faces masks of poorly concealed shock. Standing in the centre of the room, looking like a judge about to deliver a fate sentence, was Lord Henry Kensington. In his hand he clutched a crumpled piece of yellow telegraph paper. Lady Catherine stood 2 paces behind him, her eyes glittering with a toxic, triumphant glee. "Ah, Westford," Henry called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The false politeness was entirely gone, replaced by a sneering, vindictive edge. "We were just wondering if you and your companion would grace us with your presence before your inevitable departure." Arthur did not break his stride. He kept his hand firmly resting on the small of Genevieve's back, guiding her into the room with infuriating calm. "My fiancé and I have a long journey back to London, Henry. I suggest you get whatever petty grievance is currently souring your mood so we may take our leave." "Fiancé," Henry repeated, spitting the word as if it were poison. He waved the yellow paper in the air. "A fascinating term. I received a wire this morning from Mr. Ignatius Pollock of Price and Abernathy Investigations on Fleet Street. I tasked him with a rather simple inquiry into the mysterious Miss Hayes." Genevieve's heart slammed against her ribs. Price and Abernathy were notorious. They were the ruthless private agents employed by the wealthiest politicians in Parliament to unearth their rivals' deepest sins. The crimson drained from her face, her carefully constructed aristocratic armour cracking. "Mr. Pollock is remarkably thorough," Henry continued, his voice rising in volume, ensuring every guest in the room heard the prosecution. "He visited a derelict little alley in Covent Garden. He spoke to the neighbouring merchants. They confirmed that a Miss Genevieve Hayes, proprietor of a bankrupt rotting shop called the Gilded Petal, vanished precisely 3 weeks ago. Curiously, this was the exact same week the Dowager Duchess of Westford transferred a staggering sum of £10,000 from her private Coutts account." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Lady Arbuthnot raised a gloved hand to her mouth. Catherine stepped forward, unable to deny herself the defeating blow. "A transaction," she purred, looking Genevieve up and down with absolute revulsion. "You bought a peasant off the street, Arthur, to cover up your indiscretions. It is fraud. It is a grotesque mockery of the peerage. Did you really think you could parade a dirt scratcher through Mayfair and we would simply bow to her?" Genevieve felt the room tilt on its axis. The roaring of the fire was drowned out by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. It was over. The secret was out. The contract was breached. Clara would be turned out of the sanatorium, and she would likely face imprisonment for defrauding the aristocracy. She squeezed, her eyes shut, bracing for the devastating collapse of her world. But Arthur did not flinch. He did not step away from her. He did not issue a panicked denial. Instead, the Duke of Westford threw his head back and let out a dark, booming, magnificent laugh. The sound was so genuinely amused, so utterly devoid of fear, that it physically startled Henry. "You spent an exorbitant amount of money on Ignatius Pollock only to uncover half the truth, Henry?" Arthur asked, shaking his head in mock pity. He stepped forward, his posture radiating absolute lethal authority. "Yes, my mother transferred £10,000 to Miss Hayes. I am utterly baffled as to why you believe that is a scandal." Henry faltered, his brow furrowing. "It is a bribe. You paid her to play a part." I paid her family's debts, Arthur corrected, his voice dropping an octave, slicing through the room like a physical blade. The sum was a dowry settlement, Henry. Furthermore, it included the purchase of the deed to the gilded petal to be placed in a blind trust. I refused to allow the woman I loved to be burdened by the financial ruin left behind by her late father. Lies, Catherine hissed, her composure fracturing. You expect us to believe you intend to marry this commoner, that Eleanor would allow it? Arthur's eyes snapped to Catherine, burning with a cold, terrifying fury. He took Genevieve's hand, lacing his fingers tightly through hers, and pulled her flush against his side. Watch your tongue, Catherine, Arthur snarled softly, the veneer of the civilized gentleman completely vanishing to reveal the ruthless aristocrat beneath. You are speaking of my wife. Complete, suffocating silence fell over the breakfast room. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Genevieve's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the side of Arthur's face, utterly paralyzed by the magnitude of his bluff. We were married by special license 4 days ago, privately in London. Arthur lied with such unwavering, terrifying conviction that reality itself seemed to bend to his words. The paperwork was signed and sealed by Archbishop Edward White Benson of Canterbury. We kept it quiet because Genevieve is still in deep mourning for her father. But make no mistake, she is the Duchess of Westford. Henry's face flushed a deep mottled purple. I demand to see the proof. I will challenge this in the House of Lords. Arthur closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, backing Lord Henry up against the heavy oak dining table. Challenge it? Arthur whispered, his voice dripping with venom. If you breathe one word of this to the Pall Mall Gazette, Henry, if you dare to challenge the validity of an archbishop's seal, I will not just sue you for slander, I will destroy you. Arthur leaned in closer, tapping a hard finger against Henry's chest. I know precisely how deeply in debt you are to the Conservative Party. I know of your offshore investments. If you insult my wife again, I will personally walk into Prime Minister Lord Salisbury's office and ensure your political career is reduced to ash before Parliament reconvenes in the spring. Do you understand me? Lord Henry Kensington, a man who built his life on intimidating others, swallowed hard. The threat was not empty. The political capital required to publicly call a duke a liar, to challenge a supposed ecclesiastical marriage authorized by Archbishop Benson, was immense. And if Henry was wrong, Arthur's retaliation would be apocalyptic. Henry broke eye contact, staring at the floor. He crumpled the telegram in his fist. Get out of my house, Westford. With pleasure, Arthur spat. He turned, offered his arm to Genevieve with exquisite courtly grace, and escorted her out of the room without a backward glance. They packed in less than 10 minutes. The carriage ride away from Blackwood Manor was a blur of driving rain and thundering hooves. As soon as the estate disappeared behind the bleak line of the moors, the adrenaline abruptly drained from Genevieve's body. She collapsed back against the leather squabs, her hands shaking violently. Arthur moved across the carriage, pulling her onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, burying his face in her neck, his own chest heaving as the magnitude of what he had just done washed over him. Arthur, Genevieve gasped, gripping the lapels of his coat. Are you mad? Archbishop Benson? A special license? Henry will eventually check the ecclesiastical records. When he finds no marriage certificate, the perjury will ruin you far worse than Catherine ever could. I know, Arthur breathed, pressing his forehead against hers. "But it bought us time. It got you out of that house before they could tear you apart." He pulled back, his stormy eyes locking onto hers with desperate intensity. "Genevieve, there is only one way to fix this. When we reach London, we have to make the lie the truth. I will rip Parliament apart to find a bishop willing to backdate a special license. We will marry immediately." Genevieve stared at him, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "You would tie yourself to me permanently, to a florist with a trail of debt and scandal." "I would tie myself to you if you were the devil herself," Arthur vowed, kissing her fiercely, tasting her tears. "I love you. I think I have loved you since the moment you demanded more money for my abysmal manners." When the carriage finally rattled to a halt outside the Westford estate in Mayfair a day and a half later, Arthur did not pause to change out of his travel-stained clothes. He grasped Genevieve's hand and marched her past a bewildered Carson straight toward the Dowager Duchess's private parlour. He threw the heavy oak doors open. Eleanor was seated at her mahogany desk, bathed in the soft glow of the gaslight, calmly sipping Earl Grey tea. She looked up, her expression entirely unreadable. "Mother," Arthur barked, his voice ragged from travel and anxiety. "The charade is over. Henry hired Ignatius Pollock. He knew about the gilded petal. I had to force his hand to protect Genevieve. I told him we were already married by special license, signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury." Eleanor slowly set her teacup down on its saucer. A single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched upward. "Did you now?" "Yes," Arthur continued, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "And now we are trapped. Henry will eventually investigate the claim. I need you to summon the family solicitors. I need a priest. We are going to marry tonight, and I don't care what society or the House of Lords has to say about it." Genevieve stood by the door, wringing her hands, waiting for the Iron Duchess to explode, to scream that her son had ruined the family name, to demand the £10,000 be returned, to throw Genevieve onto the street. Instead, Eleanor reached into the locked bottom drawer of her desk. She withdrew a heavy cream-coloured parchment roll, bound in a thick silk ribbon and bearing a massive red wax seal. With maddening slowness, the Dowager Duchess unrolled the document and laid it flat on the mahogany table. "There will be no need for solicitors, Arthur," Eleanor said calmly, smoothing the edges of the parchment. "And you will not need to bribe a priest to backdate anything." Arthur stopped pacing. Genevieve took a tentative step forward. There, stamped at the bottom of the document, was the unmistakable official seal of the Church of England, and scrawled beneath it, in bold flowing ink, was the signature of Archbishop Edward White Benson. "What is this?" Arthur whispered, staring at the paper as if it were a ghost. "That," Eleanor replied, a slow, immensely satisfied smile breaking across her severe features, "is a genuine, legally binding special license of marriage for Arthur Sterling, Duke of Westford, and Miss Genevieve Hayes, signed, sealed, and officially logged in the ecclesiastical records of Canterbury precisely 4 days ago." Genevieve's jaw dropped. The room seemed to spin. But how? Why? Eleanor stood up, walking around the desk. She looked at her son, then at Genevieve, her eyes softening with a rare, profound warmth. "Do you honestly believe I am foolish enough to leave the fate of my family to a theatrical performance?" Eleanor asked, her tone entirely matter-of-fact. "I knew of Catherine's affair for months. I also knew that if I simply ordered you to end it, Arthur, your stubborn pride would cause you to rebel. You didn't just need a distraction. You needed a crisis. And more importantly, you needed a woman who possessed the spine to stand up to you. Eleanor turned to Genevieve, gently taking the younger woman's calloused hands in her own. I did not select you at random, Genevieve. I investigated you thoroughly. I knew of your father's brilliance. I knew of your fierce devotion to your sister Clara, and I knew you had the wit and the grit to survive the viper pit of Mayfair. I didn't want a fake engagement. The Dowager Duchess reached back, picked up the ironclad contract Genevieve had signed 3 weeks prior, the document that had ruled her life, and calmly, deliberately, tore it down the middle. She tore it again, letting the pieces flutter like fallen petals into the wastebasket. I wanted a real duchess, Eleanor stated, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The £10,000 was never a bribe, my dear. It was an investment. I merely needed to trap the two of you in a room together long enough for my stubborn son to realize what a masterpiece you are. Arthur stared at his mother, utterly gobsmacked. The realization that he, the grand manipulator of Parliament, had been entirely outmaneuvered by the Dowager Duchess washed over him. He let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his dark hair. You are a terrifying woman, Mother, Arthur said, though the words were laced with profound, reluctant awe. I am a mother protecting her legacy, Eleanor corrected, walking back to her tea. Now, I suggest you take your wife upstairs to rest. You both smell atrociously of damp horses, and you have a society to rule tomorrow. Arthur turned to Genevieve. The heavy burden of the past 3 weeks, the fear, the lies, the constant threat of ruin, evaporated, leaving only the reality of the woman standing before him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her dark hair, holding her as if he would never let go. Genevieve rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. She had come to the Westford estate to deliver 36 white lilies. She had walked into a trap, signed away her freedom, and engaged in a war with London's elite. But as Arthur's arms tightened around her, entirely real and entirely hers, Genevieve knew she hadn't just survived the aristocracy, she had conquered it. History books often sanitize the truth, painting the marriage of Arthur Sterling, Duke of Westford, and Genevieve Hayes as a sweeping, conventional fairy tale. Society records note only that the Duke fell madly in love with a brilliant botanist's daughter, forever altering the Sterling legacy. They do not mention the £10,000 blackmail, the vicious political manoeuvring of Lord Henry Kensington, or the Dowager Duchess's ruthless orchestration. In reality, their love was born in the dirt of a glass conservatory and forged in the fire of aristocratic warfare. The gilded petal was not sold. It flourished under royal patronage, funding the sanatorium that successfully cured Genevieve's sister, Clara. Arthur and Genevieve's union proved that sometimes the most enduring, authentic love stories do not begin with a stolen glance across a ballroom, but with a desperate, ironclad contract and a command to simply act the part.